I'm Dr. Nicholas O'Doney. I'm a geomorphologist and modeller. Geomorphologist is somebody who studies whole landscapes and landscape processes. But in much of my research over the last 10 years, I've also been very closely involved in looking at problems involving flooding and water and landscape. In the most general terms, my task was to try to help the community reach a deeper understanding of the flooding problem in their area, and from that possibly draw insights as to how that problem could be coped with better or indeed possibly solved. Several reasons. The first and perhaps the most important of all is that the software is free. It is well known and understood. So it's been developed by the US Army Corps of Engineers and is available as a free download to anybody in the world. There are extensive resources on the web as PDFs, as files which explain how to do things in HEC-RAS. People have done training videos on YouTube and elsewhere which show you how to use HEC-RAS and do particular things in it. Many of the consultants in this country will have used HEC-RAS for solving flooding and other water problems. It is a respected and understood piece of software. And although it's tricky to use, in terms of the amount of data required to set up a HEC-RAS model, it's not so demanding as some of the other more complicated models might be. Well, first of all, I tried to understand the scope of the problem. I have a phrase that I like to use when approaching these areas of inquiry: modelling in context. So I often begin by looking at an Ordnance Survey map of a catchment or part of a catchment, but a big area around the area that is immediately flooded, to try and get a sense of what are the data sources that might be needed, and what are the things that I need to know to get a model, in this instance HEC-RAS, working. And from that, and discussing with the locals what are the things that particularly concern them, I set about doing a fairly crude, simplistic version of the system that they're asking me to look at. And so in the Otley context, there is a residential area of two lanes, two roadways, and also a path and parkland area, which was immediately of concern to the residents. And I began by setting up simplistic models in HEC-RAS, cross-sections in what in engineering terms we call 1D, of flows down those lanes and across the park, just to get a sense of how much water the residents were dealing with on the days of the flood, or the floods, because there were two in fact, one in November and one in Boxing Day. And I would start to talk to the residents about how the model is set up, and briefly, simplifying the physics, just how it works, and what those simplistic models are showing them. And it's fascinating then to see how they respond and the inquiries which immediately come out of that process. Always the whole time in my mind being prepared to approximate the system rather than say we need an absolute truth from the word go. And I think that's something that certainly most of the locals that I've worked with, whether in Otley or in other projects, feel quite comfortable with. Many of them are not scientists anyway, or if they have any scientific training, it's not been used for a very long time. So they're prepared to engage in it in that way. It becomes, I think, more intriguing for them, and energising and stimulating, and it's also less terrifying. It's not as if we have to build this perfect, great structure from the word go. We can start with little bits, frame it roughly, and then go into greater detail as the modelling process itself and discussion with the locals reveals further points of inquiry which we wish to investigate. I'd have liked more time, definitely. HECRAS, even for somebody like me who's used it a bit before, HECRAS is what's called a hydraulic model, and I've worked mainly with hydrological models. But I have used it before. But even for me as an experienced modeller, it's a tricky bit of software to use. There are various characteristics about the way the different frames work which aren't terribly user-friendly. And there are lots of basic principles about setting up cross-sections of a river channel and then a reach, and then how you connect reaches together, which are not straightforward. There are particular rules that you have to follow rigidly in HECRAS or the thing won't run. And so I was a bit scared about that. I was scared that the locals were going to get bored, or they were going to say this is too difficult that we can't do it. But I thought, well, what we'll do really is we'll set up a synthetic channel, a fictitious one, but I'll just happen to give it dimensions which very, very closely resemble one particular part of the system that we were looking at. And I'll ask them to set it up, and I'll show them how to do it, and then I'll ask them to pass water down it, and see if they get a buzz out of seeing how the water behaves. And I'm pleased to say, even though we only had 2 hours in which to do this on one fairly compressed evening, I think most of them took to it very readily and were actually rather enthused about what they found. Oh, it's very stimulating. It's very challenging as well, because there's a lot to prepare between meetings, and there's always the sense that I have to deliver for the next meeting. I have to follow up on the queries which have arisen in the previous meeting and the ideas for further model development or other inquiries that might be pursued, and then try and make sure I've at least managed to deliver some of that for the next meeting. Now, the difficulty is reality is messy, and trying to adapt a modelling system like HECRAS to incorporate some of these ideas can be fiendishly difficult. And there's also the problem that a group may want you to look at 3 or 4 different aspects of a system at once. Any one of those aspects might be deeply challenging in its own right. To try and do the lot is simply becomes impossible. So you have to, in some way, convey to the meeting, well, I can't do it all. We need to decide between us how we prioritise what we do next. Or I will say, well, I will try and do this first, and then if time permits, come on to that bit later and make sure the group is satisfied with that order of working through the problem.